Welcome to the Compliance 911 Show, a no-nonsense podcast discussing hot topics for today's busy compliance professional. It's everything you wanted to know about regulatory compliance, but we're afraid to ask. And now, here are your hosts, Dean Stockford of M&M Consulting and Len Suzio of GeoData Vision.
Welcome to our podcast series addressing everything you wanted to know about regulatory compliance, but we're afraid to ask. I can't get that word out of my mouth this morning. Holy smokes. Well, Len, good day to you. It's great to see you. It's hard to believe that summer has come to an end and the leaves are changing and the cold is on its way. So what interesting topic do you plan to discuss in today's fall podcast?
Well, Dean, during the last 3 years, we've seen a record number of referrals to the DOJ for redlining allegations. Virtually every one of those referrals was based on disparate impact identified by statistical significance analysis. You might think, well, so what? The Trump administration announced it intends to de-emphasize disparate impact. So what's the point in discussing a regulatory practice that looks like it will be out of practice by the regulators under the Trump administration? And my response is that we currently have a client that had been accused of redlining based on disparate impact, largely by applying statistical significance. But the regulators recently notified the bank they intend to change the accusation from disparate impact to disparate treatment based on the findings of statistical significance. So I believe it's important for bankers to understand the strengths and weaknesses of statistical significance. And even if the de-emphasis on disparate impact during the Trump administration will reduce the use of statistical significance, it's bound to return. So every banker should be familiar with the concept, its application for regulatory compliance, and when it may produce meaningless and sometimes even misleading results.
Yeah, I agree with you that statistical significance may go into hibernation, but it's not dead, and I believe it is likely to remain significant in the regulatory landscape. But so where do we go? Where do we begin, I should say, Len?
Sure. Well, I believe it's incumbent to understand the concepts underlying statistical significance so we know its strengths and its weaknesses and when its results are valid and when they can be misleading.
You say misleading. Can statistical significance yield misleading results? I think most bankers believe that their bank has statistically significant results. It's doomsday or doomsday for them if, in fact, they were statistically significant. So the case is open and shut. Can statistically significant results actually be wrong?
Oh, yes. In a nutshell, yes. Statistically significant results can be misleading. But before we delve into that topic, I believe it's important to understand what statistical significance is and how it is computed.
All right, let's begin.
All right. Well, I believe a lot of bankers don't understand that statistical analysis using statistical significance is not directly based on the bank's numbers. It's based on a computation of chance or probability using a completely neutral set of data. It's identical to a card game in which cards are face down on the table and a certain percentage of the cards are black and a complementary percentage of the cards are red. What the statistician wants to do is to predict the probability of a player picking a certain number or percentage of the red cards. So let's say that there are 100 cards of which 10 are red and 90 are black. The percentage of red cards is obviously 10% in this example. Every time you turn over a card, you have a 10% chance of picking a red card. If you pick 10 cards, you are likely to have at least one red card. If you pick 30 cards, it's probable that you are going to pick at least 3 red cards. But suppose you turn over 30 cards and have only one red card, or there are no red cards. What is the likelihood of that happening? Statistical significance is based on the concept that a result is so extreme, so unlikely, so far from the norm or the average that it is statistically significant. In other words, the result is so extreme that the likelihood it happened by chance is very, very low. And if it didn't happen by chance, then maybe the lender is doing or not doing something that affects the results, causing it to be below average performance. Now, to determine the probability of a result occurring due to chance, statistical analysis repeats the selection of cards over and over again. This is called a factorial computation. And it basically exhausts every potential combination of possibilities. Once that is done, a statistician has a normal curve that depicts the distribution of possible results. If you can imagine in your mind a bell curve, I think everybody's heard of and seen bell curves before. Within that curve, the results are accumulated around the center, which is called the mean. Some results are very close to the mean, and some results are very far away at the tail of the curve. Those results at the far end of the curve happen very, very infrequently. The farther out the result, the less likely it is to happen by chance. This is the concept underlying statistical significance. Now, for disparate impact and for redlining, the question for bankers is, how far below the average majority-minority tract penetration rate of the market or my peers can I go and not be accused of redlining? If the average MMCT penetration rate in the market is 10%, what constitutes a result so extreme that's highly unlikely to have happened by chance and therefore is statistically significant and the basis for a referral to the DOJ for prosecuting for redlining?
Wow, that's a lot. And and before I go on here, I just want just one thing that it kind of is confusing when you talk about the disparate impact theory going away and how your particular client was challenged, I should say, by the regulators on disparate treatment. And I'm just trying to reconcile that in my head because you're treating people, I get it, unfairly, but typically, I think the last big case we saw in that area, Len, had to do with credit reporting and for married couples versus unmarried couples and the cost that was associated with that. That's a form of disparate treatment. So it kind of baffles me that the regulator has kind of adopted that theory, the disparate treatment theory, as opposed to disparate impact. I just don't see the two things being the same. But in any
Well, I agree with you. We were shocked when the client told us that, but it tells me that the examiners are intent on using statistical analysis as the foundation for redlining allegations, even though disparate impact is being, you can't say it's being eliminated by the Trump administration because it's got a long history, a long legal history, and it's going right to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court itself made a decision in a case called Inclusive Communities, in which it said statistical significance has a role in establishing if there's redlining going on, but it's not sufficient itself to prove redlining. But it's nonetheless a useful tool for identifying the potential situation of redlining.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And again, who knows what's going to happen 3 or 4 years from now when the new administration comes in too. So I don't think disparate impact is going to be completely eliminated, but its use is going to be drastically reduced. And if the regulators are concerned about a bank potentially engaged in redlining, they're going to use statistical significance analysis as at least the foundation for building a case on that. So
yeah, you're right on that. You're right on that, Len. So the heart of the matter for bankers then is how far can our bank be below the market before the examiners determine it is statistically significant?
Yeah. Well, again, statistical significance models are based on the likelihood of a result being based on chance or the probability of it happening without cause. Just dumb, bad luck in this case. So when the average majority-minority census tract, the MMCT penetration rate is 10%, and the bank's results are 8%, is that so far away from the mean that the likelihood of it happening by chance is very small or bad luck? Does that explain the result?
Yeah. Well, what's the answer?
I'd like to bait you, Dean. I knew you were going to ask me that. Well, examiners use another concept called the level of statistical significance, and they use a 5% level for regulatory compliance. That means they take the probability curve based on chance, and they consider any outcome that occurs by chance 5% or less of the time to be statistically significant. In other words, a bank's majority minority census tract penetration rate is so extreme, there's only a remote possibility, less than 5%, that it was caused by chance or bad luck.
Hmm. So then, so what? So what's the answer to the example? If a bank has majority minority census tract penetration rate of 8%, and the market or peer average is 10%, is that result statistically significant at that 5% level?
Well, the answer to that is how many applications or originations a bank has processed. The more applications or originations processed by the bank, the closer it must be to the market average to avoid a statistically significant result at the 5% level of significance. And to make it more clear, I'm going to go through a couple of examples of a couple theoretical
Mm,
situations. So let's
mm,
again say we're talking about the market having 10% of its penetration rate in the majority minority tracts. So if a bank, so here's, I'm going to go through 6 different cases. Number one, if a bank processes only 10 applications, there is no statistically significant level of performance. Because the bank processed only 10 records, there's a much higher probability of error due to too few observations. Could easily end up with no applications or 50% applications. In other words, 5 of the 10 applications in the MMCTs. So, under those circumstances, statistical significance is not possible. Second example, if a bank processes 100 applications, the required minimum majority minority census tract volume would be 5% or 5 applications. In other words, half the majority minority census tract penetration rate. And that's so basically a bank at that point in time could get away with having only a 5% penetration rate, even though the market's at 10%. And again, you could see there's quite a bit of latitude because they process only 100 applications. Now, let's go to a third example where a bank processes 200 applications, double the 100. Required minimum majority minority census tract volume would be 6.5% or 13 applications. So what do you see here? So the standard, the minimum standard has been increasing from 0 to 5% to now 6.5% with 200 applications. But let's go a little bit farther. The bank processes 500 applications. Required minimum majority minority census tract volume would be 7.8% or 39 applications. So you can see, even though the market standard is still 10%, based on the bank's volume, it's being required to get closer and closer to what the market average is or the peer group average. But let's go even farther. If a bank processes 1,000 applications, required minimum majority minority census tract volume would be 8.4% or 84 applications. So again, that's compared to the 10% threshold. And finally, let's take a look at a bank that processes 10,000 applications. When I say processing 10,000 applications, I'm talking about in the REMA or the market on which the 10% is predicated. In that situation, the required minimum majority minority census tract volume would be 9.5% or 950 applications. So you can see now, the more volume the bank processes, the closer it's got to be to the market standard. There's less tolerance for a deviation that's significant. You can see the more records a bank processes, the closer it must be to the market average market majority minority census tract penetration rate. And it goes from 0 in my example to 9.5% in those samples that I just reviewed. Obviously, the more volume a bank processes, the closer it must approach the actual market majority minority census tract penetration rate. And at 9.5%, the margin for error is only 0.5% below the market average.
Yeah, and this has always been something that we've run into, especially for what I would call some of those smaller clients, and it's hard because, we do the statistical analysis and find out, yes, they have a statistical significant variance, but then you go in and you start peeling back the onion, you find out, well, if you only had 2 more applications or 2 more originations, you would have been out of that statistically significant area. It's just because they're such a low volume lender in particular areas, but it's unfortunate. So now that we have some insight, I'll say, into how statistical significance works for the disparate impact and redlining analysis, what are the weaknesses?
Well, and this is a very important question. There's an assumption underlying statistical significance models. And that assumption is what I call a ceteris paribus assumption, meaning that's Latin for all things being equal. In other words, all things being equal, or the playing field is level. But there are many situations in which there are what statisticians call lurking or confounding variables that skew the market or peer data. There are two egregious circumstances that I have seen when analyzing banks threatened with a referral to the DOJ. First, the market for which the data is analyzed must be truly a reasonable and fair market that represents a bank's actual market. The regulators have developed the concept of UREMA, or reasonably expected market area, for this purpose. However, there's no regulatory definition of UREMA, and the application of the concept by regulators has been inconsistent. If UREMA is not realistic, statistical analysis can be meaningless. In fact, it could be misleading. In the past 3 years, we've seen several examples of what I call a UREMA, an unreasonable expected market area, that made it virtually impossible for a bank to avoid a statistically significant result. In one case, examiners insisted on expanding the UREMA to include nearby counties where a bank had no branches, but where large urban populations with a great number of majority-minority tracts existed. The bank was at a significant competitive disadvantage and, not surprisingly, had a statistically significant result. There's a second situation, too, where the peer competition, although processing a similar volume of applications, and the standard usually is 50 to 200% of your institution's applications, may have significant competitive advantages. So last year, we were helping a bank avoid a referral to the DOJ. Once again, the bank's results were statistically significant. We noticed that half of the 45 peers were mortgage companies. When we applied the statistical significance concept to all the banks, not just the bank that we were helping out, but all the banks in the peer group, 18 of the 21 peer banks failed the test. However, when we removed the mortgage companies from the peer group, all but 3 of the banks had results that were not statistically significant. It's imperative that true peers be selected for comparison. When a peer group is selected that results in abnormally large numbers of peers failing the test, it's a strong indication of a, quote, confounding variable that demonstrates the market data is skewed.
Yeah, and we've worked on several of these cases, Len and I. We've run into this regularly, and this is very interesting. It's certainly a complex topic that has large implications for every lender in the country. So I think you've done just a fabulous job making it understandable for our audience. And while the regulatory focus may shift over time under the administration, or as you put it, go into a hibernation, the need for statistical analysis to quantify risk and monitor compliance will likely persist. And I certainly encourage folks to not be complacent. You heard me say that probably several times at our regulatory risk conference, because I think this is the period of time that people do kind of let their guard down a little bit, and that's when you get stung. So that's my 2 cents for today, and this is Dean Stockford from M&M Consulting.
And this is Led Suzio of Geodata Vision saying that we hope you enjoyed today's podcast and found it informative. Please don't hesitate to send us any requests that you may have for future podcasts.
Thanks for listening to the Compliance 911 Show. If you like the podcast, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. While you're at it, please give us a like and review to help others find the show. As always, links are in the show notes, and you can always find us online at compliance911show.com. Follow M&M Consulting and Geodata Vision on LinkedIn for all the latest news and information on compliance hot topics.